Job was not a famous man. He was not a king whose name echoed through palaces. He did not lead armies, shape nations, or build monuments that would outlive him. There were no songs written about him while he lived. No crowds gathered to hear his voice. No public recognition followed his steps. And yet Scripture introduces him with a title more powerful than status. He was righteous. Not righteous because his life was perfect. Not righteous because everything went his way, but righteous because his heart was steady. Job lived a quiet life. He worked the land with his hands. He provided for his family. He woke up, did his work, and went to sleep with a clear conscience. He feared God, and he turned away from evil. There was no drama in his faith, no performance, no need to be seen or admired. Faith for Job was not something he displayed. It was something he lived day after day in the ordinary rhythm of life. And that is why his story matters. Because most people believe suffering comes to the reckless, to the careless, to those who make poor decisions. But Job's story quietly dismantles that belief. Because suffering does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it comes without warning, without explanation, without a reason we can understand. And here is the question that forms beneath Job's life. What happens to faith when everything collapses, even though you did everything right? Job built his life patiently, with integrity, with discipline, with reverence. And in a very short span of time, everything began to disappear. The work of years vanished. His animals were taken. His servants were gone. Before the weight of one loss could settle, another arrived, and then another, and then another. Loss stacked upon loss, faster than grief could process, until finally the suffering reached the deepest place a human heart can know. His children, all of them, in one moment. Silence followed, a silence so heavy it cannot be described, a silence that steals language from the soul. Job tore his robe. He fell to the ground, not in rebellion, not in accusation, but in grief, and heaven remained silent. No explanation came, no voice broke the sky, no reassurance softened the pain, only silence. This is where many people misunderstand faith. Faith is easy when God explains himself. Faith is easy when suffering comes with answers. But what about when it does not? What about when heaven says nothing? Job stood at the edge of a question that still confronts us today. Can faith survive when God is silent? And this is only the beginning. The losses were not the end of Job's suffering. They were only the beginning. Because grief has a way of opening the door to something deeper, something more personal, something that reaches beyond circumstance and enters the body itself. Job's suffering moved from his world into his flesh. Painful sores covered his skin. Sleep abandoned him. Strength drained slowly from his bones. The man who once stood respected now sat in ashes. Weak, exposed, unrecognizable. This is where suffering becomes especially cruel. Because now it is not only loss, it is endurance. Endurance without explanation, endurance without relief, endurance without answers. Those who remained around Job could not understand what they were seeing. His pain disturbed them. The silence of God unsettled them, so they searched for explanations. They suggested causes. They offered theories. They tried to protect their understanding of God by assigning blame to Job. Surely, they said, this must be punishment. Surely there must be hidden sin. Surely God would not allow this unless Job had failed somewhere. But suffering does not always follow our logic. Job listened, and then he spoke. Not with polished words, not with careful theology. He cried out. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Questions without filters. Questions soaked in pain. Why was I born? Why does God remain silent? Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked seem to prosper? These were not questions meant to be debated. They were the language of a wounded soul. And this is where many people misunderstand faith. They believe faith means silence. That true belief never questions, that pain should be hidden behind polite words. But Job shows us something different. Faith is not pretending everything is fine. Faith is not suppressing grief to appear strong. Faith is remaining. Job did not walk away. He did not curse God and disappear. He stayed. He argued. He wrestled. He struggled. But he stayed. His faith did not look confident. It looked exhausted, worn down, barely standing. And yet it was real. This is the kind of faith heaven recognizes. Not the faith that performs, but the faith that persists. Because anyone can believe when blessings are visible. Anyone can trust when answers are clear. But what about when prayer feels unanswered? When heaven feels closed? When God seems distant? Job teaches us an uncomfortable truth. God's silence does not mean God's absence. And suffering is not always correction. It is not always punishment. Sometimes it is part of a story larger than we can see. And Job was standing inside that story without understanding it. Yet, for a long time, God said nothing. No correction, no explanation, no comfort. Job spoke, his friends spoke, arguments filled the silence, but heaven remained closed. This is where the tension of the story reaches its breaking point, because silence, when it lasts too long, begins to feel like abandonment. Job had lost everything: his strength, his family, his reputation, even his certainty. And still, God waited. Not because Job's pain was insignificant, not because his questions were offensive, but because what Job needed was not an answer. It was a revelation. And then, when Job had reached the end of himself, God finally spoke. Not softly, not gently, not with sympathy. God spoke from the storm, not to explain suffering, not to justify loss, but to reveal perspective. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you ever commanded the morning? Can you bind the stars or loosen the cords of the heavens? God did not answer Job's questions. He answered Job himself. He reminded Job that faith was never about understanding everything. It was about knowing who holds everything. In that moment, Job realized something profound. He had been trying to understand God from the center of his pain. But pain was never meant to be the lens through which God is defined. God did not minimize Job's suffering. He reframed it, not by giving reasons, but by revealing his nature. Job saw that the universe was not chaotic, that his suffering was not random, that his pain was not invisible. God was not absent. He was sovereign. And Job's response is one of the most powerful moments in Scripture. He did not demand answers. He did not defend his questions. He humbled himself. I spoke of things I did not understand, Job said, things too wonderful for me to know. This was the turning point, not because circumstances changed, but because Job's posture changed. Faith matured. It moved from needing explanations to resting in trust. Job learned that faith is not believing God will do what we want. Faith is trusting God when we do not understand what He is doing. This is the climax of the story, not restoration, not blessing, but surrender, because real faith is born when control dies. And that is what God was forming in Job all along, a faith that does not depend on outcomes, a faith that survives storms, a faith that remains, even when everything else is stripped away. Job did not receive answers. He received God, and that was enough. In the end, Job's life was restored. His health returned, his strength came back, his days were filled again. But that is not the heart of the story, because if the story of Job were only about restoration, then faith would simply become a transaction. Endure pain, and God will reward you. But Job teaches us something far deeper. The heart of the story is not what Job received at the end. It is what Job refused to release in the middle. He never let go of God, even when God was silent, even when answers never came, even when faith felt heavy instead of strong. Job shows us that faith is not certainty. Faith is not clarity. Faith is not emotional stability. Faith is staying. Staying when walking away would be easier. Staying when bitterness feels justified. Staying when silence stretches longer than hope. This story matters because it speaks directly to real life, to the seasons where prayers feel unanswered, to the moments where obedience seems unrewarded, to the nights where heaven feels closed. If you are listening right now and you are walking through loss, confusion, or quiet pain, this story is for you. You are not weak for asking hard questions. You are not faithless for feeling exhausted. You are not broken because you do not understand. Job teaches us that questioning God is not the opposite of faith. Leaving is. Faith does not require polished words. It does not require strength you do not have. It requires honesty and presence. God never rebuked Job for his pain. He never condemned him for his questions. He honored him for staying. And maybe that is what you need to hear today. That your faith does not have to look impressive. It does not have to sound confident. It does not have to feel victorious. It only has to remain. Because God's silence does not mean his absence. And suffering does not mean you are forgotten. Sometimes God is doing his deepest work in the seasons where he explains the least. Job never understood the full reason for his suffering, but he came to understand something greater, that God could be trusted even when life could not be explained. And that is the invitation of the story, not to have all the answers, but to hold on. If this reflection spoke to you, if it met you in a quiet or painful place, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel for more thoughtful Bible reflections, stories that sit with suffering, and faith that speaks honestly about silence. And if you know someone who needs this message, share it with them today. Because sometimes faith begins simply by staying.